Hey everybody, welcome to Lecture 3, The Sorcerer's Kidney Stone, wherein we discuss the phosphorus cycle. If you think back to last lecture, you may remember that we were talking about the three elements in the Redfield ratio, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, that are present in all plant life on Earth. And so we were starting to explore each of those, and in the last lecture we talked about nitrogen. Well, we're on to phosphorus with this lecture. And to begin with, I wanted to start with a story about the discovery of phosphorus because it'll be kind of interesting later on when we talk about phosphorus and ways of dealing with the current the current situation in terms of what is called the phosphorus time bomb, which we'll get to in the next lecture. All right, our story begins with this guy, Hennig Bront. He was an alchemist, which were sort of the predecessors to a modern chemist. They weren't actually scientists. They sort of had this pseudo-magical perspective on the natural world. Often they were consumed with the search for the philosopher's stone or the sorcerer's stone. This was a stone that was said to imbue the possessor with the ability to make drafts of immortality and to convert lead into gold. Well, this guy did outlive two rich wives. He was consumed with this search for the philosopher's stone, but he made his money initially as a uroscopist. And a uroscopist is a person who was sort of like a doctor, also kind of a little bit of a quack, but this was a person who would look at a sample of your urine and diagnose various problems with you based upon whether it was bubbly, what color it was it cloudy, what did it smell like, what did it taste like. Whew. Yeah. Anyways, so the first wife he married, she died, and he inherited all of her wealth and a stepson. And then he married again. This second wealthy woman, who was probably a client of his as a uroscopist, also died. So he had a bit of a knack for picking out rich women with health problems, perhaps as a uroscopist, by virtue of being a uroscopist. And he got another stepson. So now he's got a pile of cash and two stepsons and a pretty healthy business collecting and analyzing urine. So he had his stepsons go out into the bars of Flanders or wherever he was in the Netherlands and collect large quantities, quote, take a good large quantity of new-made urine of beer drinkers and evaporate it gently to the consistency of honey. In fact, he gathered up 1,500 gallons of urine, 1,500 gallons of urine, and let it just sort of sit and get funky in the basement lab of his estate house that he had at this point. And then after a year of letting it sit there and get kind of gnarly, started to boil it down. And I'm sure that was fun for him and his nephews. It must have smelled great in there. But slowly boil it down, and eventually, he had a long recipe that he went through. Eventually, the only thing that was left after 1,500 gallons of beer urine had been boiled away was a golf ball-sized lump of this waxy material that glowed in the freaking dark. Well, you can imagine his stepsons were like, dang, that guy has something going on. He's tapped into something here. Um, yeah. So what was going on? Well, we eat phosphorus in our diet. It's in the food we eat. It's in beer. In fact, there's plenty of phosphorus in beer in terms of the nucleic acids that might be in there and the other phosphate salts that are in there. He wanted to convert that beer into the Sorcerer's Stone and then eventually into gold. That didn't really work for him, but he did get white phosphorus. So the P out, the phosphorus that comes out of your body, must be equal to the phosphorus coming in. The bottom line, the reason I'm telling this story is that we need dietary phosphorus. We are losing it every day, every time we urinate. Some phosphorus is leaving our body, so there needs to be a dietary source of phosphorus. Here is his recipe. You can look it up, and I wouldn't suggest trying it at home. But if you really wanted a little waxy lump of glow-in-the-dark phosphorescent elemental phosphorus, this is one way of doing it. All right, so phosphorus is an essential element for life. We need it. It's part of the nucleic acids that make up the DNA and RNA in our bodies. It's part of the phospholipids, the fats that make up the lipid membrane of our cells. It's part of the mineral content of our bones and teeth. So our skeleton, it has a huge supply of phosphorus in it. And then it's also part of adenosine triphosphate, which is the molecule of life, ATP. And you see a picture of that on the lower right-hand corner. And that ATP, I call it the molecule of life. It's really like the $5 bill of energy, the energy currency in our bodies. So most reactions that have an uphill battle that they need to overcome, they're going to burn an ATP, and we'll get to that a little bit later in the semester. But phosphorus is in all of these things. All right, so because phosphorus is essential to life, it thus must be essential to agriculture. Let's introduce this guy named Justus von Liebig, who lived throughout the middle of the 19th century. He came up with this concept, Liebig's law of the minimum. And the idea is that there are all of these different components that are necessary for the growth of a plant or whatever organism. And if one of the elements, one of the nutritive elements that plant requires is deficient or lacking, growth will be poor, even when all else that the plant requires is abundant. And the way he analogized this was by thinking of a barrel, where each of the different staves, each of the different boards that makes up a barrel is one of the different nutritive components of a plant, the different elements that the plant needs. And say they're all nice and tall, except one of them, if it's low, the barrel won't hold any water above the lowest stave in that barrel. So you can have a plant that has everything else going for it, but if there is one nutrient that's deficient, that nutrient is going to limit the production. All right, so this is Liebig's law of the minimum. Does it work? Well, turns out most of the time. And when you're considering a plant, the production of a plant, phosphorus or nitrogen are typically the elements that are going to limit the primary production of that crop. However, it gets a little bit complicated because sometimes you can have co-limitation. Maybe nitrogen and phosphorus are both limiting. And you can also have limitation from different micronutrients, such as potassium, molybdenum, silicon, iron, etc. So here is a picture of the phosphorus cycle and where phosphorus is coming from for us. So there's really two phosphorus cycles that we're going to be able to consider. There's the slow and the fast, still very slow phosphorus cycle. The thing about the phosphorus cycle is that there is no gaseous form of phosphorus. Phosphorus is only found as a solid or a solute dissolved in water of some sort. So phosphorus itself, there's a fair amount of it on Earth, about 0.1%, so 1/10 of 1% by mass of the average rock making up the planet is made of phosphorus. And because of that, the Earth has a vast supply, although it's very dilute. It's only 1/1000th of the mass of any given sample of the Earth. It is pretty much everywhere in rock. So it's very dilute, and concentrated sources of phosphorus are kind of rare. In 2017, the USGS estimated that there were about 68 billion tons of phosphorus in the world reserves that were easily extractable. That number, it changes all the time because they're very rough estimates. And in 2016, we mined about a quarter of a billion tons of the stuff. 261 million tons were mined in 2016. Where does it come from? The phosphate that's found in rocks gets washed away by the process of erosion, washes down into the valleys and the low places, and then becomes dissolved phosphate in the water column, is taken up by various macrophytes or plants and algae in the water, which are eaten by animals, and it works its way up the food chain. And it also gets sedimented into the rock and then becomes phosphate rock and goes through that process of becoming a mountain and then eventually wearing away into the ocean again. Super duper slow. This diagram here shows some of the phosphate that's in the biosphere, however, that is mined or for fertilizer and goes into crops, taken up into animals, animal waste and decomposition, goes into the soil phosphates picked up by the plants. And so there's a much quicker cycle right there. So let's look at the slow and the fast P cycles. In the slow phosphorus cycle, rock is eroded into soil, which is washed into the ocean. This is about a 500 million year long journey. This takes a really long time, 500 million years. The planet's only like life is only like 3.4 billion years old on Earth. So that's a really slow process. Phosphorus that is sorbed into some sort of a mineral may never interact with biology at all. It may never be taken up by a plant. It may never become part of the biological phosphorus, the biological component of the phosphorus cycle. But some of it does. And this is a much shorter, faster cycle within a cycle. The rock erodes and is taken up into the biomass and cycles back and forth with the soil. All right. So a phosphorus atom may be in the biomass loop for hundreds of thousands of years, back and forth, being taken up by a plant that gets eaten by an animal. The animal either craps or dies and decomposes, releases its phosphorus, which is again taken up by a plant, going around and around and around before eventually maybe it's able to escape the biological loop and then go back into the slow P cycle. So phosphorus that is found in soil, water, plants, and animals can be there for thousands of years, and phosphorus can stay in a lake or river sediments without being able to be exported very readily. We're going to talk about that in the next lecture. But there's the basic science of phosphorus and the phosphorus cycle. So we're going to talk about phosphorus fertilizer and problems with phosphorus in the next lecture. So stay tuned for that. That's where you're going to get the philosopher's kidney stone joke is the punchline will finally come home. All right. Thanks. Bye.